A police officer pulls over a black man, mocking and searching him without cause. But just minutes later, he freezes in shock as the man pulls out his badge, revealing himself as the last person the officer ever wanted to cross. Los Angeles, late at night. The streets were mostly empty, the occasional car gliding through wet pavement. A recent drizzle left streaks of light shimmering across the asphalt. Nathaniel Carter gripped the wheel of his black Mercedes, posture relaxed but attentive. His tailored gray suit remained crisp despite the long hours at the office. Another exhausting day overseeing internal affairs. Too many complaints, too little accountability. The traffic light flicked from red to green. He exhaled, pressed the gas, and let the city fade behind him. Then, flashing lights filled his rearview mirror. Red and blue strobes reflected off his car's polished surface, followed by a single, sharp wail of the siren. Short, deliberate. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Again. He signaled and pulled over, watching in the side mirror as the patrol car stopped behind him. A broad-shouldered figure emerged, moving with slow, deliberate confidence. A firm knock on the window. No hesitation. Nathaniel lowered it. The officer stood tall, his hand resting near his holster. Not an outright threat, but not far from one either. Square jaw, buzz cut, sharp gaze, every bit the image of authority. License and registration. Now. The voice was clipped, devoid of pleasantries. Nathaniel met his gaze but didn't move immediately. The officer's expression was unreadable, but there was something else there. Something familiar. Nathaniel had seen it before, too many times to count. Without a word, he reached into the glove compartment, retrieving his wallet and documents. The officer took them, scanning his license before flicking his gaze back. A pause. The officer's lip curled slightly. "A car like this?" A smirk. "Didn't peg you for the type." Nathaniel said nothing. The officer tapped the license against his fingers. "Where you headed?" Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. "Home." The officer's smirk widened. "We'll see about that." Nathaniel remained still as the officer turned toward his cruiser. He didn't know it yet, but tonight, he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Larson scanned the license, eyes narrowing slightly. His fingers tapped against the edge, a slow, deliberate rhythm. He glanced at Nathaniel, then at the car. The smirk forming on his lips wasn't casual. It carried something else, something sharper. "A car like this?" He let out a quiet chuckle. "Didn't peg you for the type." Nathaniel didn't react. He'd heard variations of that line before, each one loaded with the same unspoken accusation. Larson tilted his head, eyes flicking between the license and the man in front of him. "Makes me wonder," he mused, "how exactly someone like you gets their hands on a ride like this." Nathaniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened for a brief second before he forced himself to relax. "My name and address are on that license," he said, voice even. "That should be enough." Larson exhaled through his nose, his smirk widening as if entertained by Nathaniel's restraint. "Where you headed?" "Home." "Must be nice." Larson's fingers drummed against the license again. "What's in the trunk?" Nathaniel arched a brow. "Groceries." Larson nodded slowly, as if considering something. Then he took a step back and casually rested his hand on the grip of his holstered gun. "Step out of the vehicle." Nathaniel didn't move. The tension in the air thickened, the stillness between them pressing like a weight. "I wasn't aware this was a full stop and search," Nathaniel said, keeping his tone neutral. Larson's smirk disappeared. "I wasn't aware I needed your permission." Nathaniel let the silence stretch, watching Larson's posture, the way his stance shifted just slightly forward. The officer wanted a reaction. Nathaniel wasn't going to give him one. He unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. As he stepped out, Larson took a deliberate step back, eyes scanning over him as if assessing a threat. Hands where I can see them. Nathaniel lifted them slightly, palms open. That necessary? Larson's expression didn't change. Standard procedure. Nathaniel noted the way Larson's grip lingered near his gun. Turn around. Face the car. Nathaniel held his gaze for a moment longer before complying. He placed his hands against the cool surface of the car's hood, his posture composed. Larson took his time stepping closer, dragging out the moment. The boots on asphalt, the slow exhale. Calculated movements designed to establish dominance. Then came the pat-down. Not rushed, not routine. Purposefully slow. A display rather than a procedure. Nathaniel kept his expression unreadable, though he felt the deliberate pressure of Larson's hands, pressing just a little too firmly against his pockets, lingering a little too long at his sides. You carry a weapon? Nathaniel turned his head slightly. You'd already know if I did. Larson smirked, but didn't respond. His hands moved to the inside of Nathaniel's jacket, searching, pushing, waiting for a reason. Nothing. Larson exhaled sharply through his nose as he stepped back. You're clean. The words were clipped, almost reluctant. Nathaniel straightened, adjusting his suit jacket. Of course I am. For the first time, Larson looked genuinely irritated. His fingers flexed at his side, as if resisting the urge to react. Nathaniel watched as Larson took a step back, his jaw tightening. Then, Larson's smirk returned. You seem real comfortable with how this works, he said. Almost like you've done this before. Nathaniel's lips pressed into a thin line. I believe in being prepared, Larson hummed. That right. He took a slow step forward, closing the space between them again. Or maybe you just know how to play the system. Nathaniel's expression remained unreadable. Maybe. Larson's smirk faded. He wasn't used to being met with composure. You got a problem with how I'm conducting this stop? Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. Should I? Larson's hand twitched near his belt. Careful how you answer that. Nathaniel let the words settle, his gaze steady. Then slowly he shook his head. No problem at all. Larson studied him, waiting for something, anything to crack in Nathaniel's demeanor. But there was nothing. The silence stretched again, thicker this time. Then, Larson let out a small laugh and took another step back. Well, he said, slipping Nathaniel's license into his chest pocket. Let's see what else we find. Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. You've already searched me. Larson shrugged. I don't take chances. He turned, moving toward the car's passenger side. I'll be checking the trunk. Nathaniel watched him, his expression unreadable. Larson's hand dropped to his radio, his fingers pressing down on the mic. Dispatch, I've got a suspicious vehicle here. I'm going to need backup. Nathaniel's stomach went tight, though his face remained impassive. Larson wasn't backing down. He was escalating, and he still had no idea who he was dealing with. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, steadying himself. This had just become a waiting game, and Larson was about to lose. Larson exhaled slowly, as if contemplating his next move. His fingers grazed the edge of his belt, close to his holster. Not quite a threat, but not far from one either. His eyes flicked back to Nathaniel, then to the car. He stepped in closer. Turn around, Larson ordered, voice low. Nathaniel didn't react immediately. He studied the officer's face, noting the way Larson's jaw tightened when he didn't move fast enough. Something wrong, officer, Larson's smirk returned. Not yet. Nathaniel met his gaze for a moment longer, then turned. Larson patted him down again, this time rougher. His hands pressed against Nathaniel's pockets, lingering longer than necessary. He pushed into the lining of Nathaniel's suit jacket, fingers curling, as if expecting something to be there. There was nothing. Still, Larson continued, hands moving with deliberate slowness. A display. Nathaniel stayed still. He wasn't going to flinch, wasn't going to react. That was what Larson wanted. Larson stepped back, lips pressed into a thin line. "Empty pockets," he muttered. The words sounded almost disappointed. Nathaniel turned to face him, adjusting his jacket. "Satisfied?" Larson huffed. "Not yet." He glanced down at the license still in his hand. "Nathaniel Carter," he repeated, as if testing how the name felt on his tongue. "What is it you do, Mr. Carter?" Nathaniel offered a small, unreadable smile. "A job that requires me to understand the law very well." Larson let out a low chuckle. "That's so." His gaze hardened. "You a lawyer or something?" Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering his response. "Something like that." Larson's fingers tightened around the license. He didn't like that answer. "People who know the law usually know how to bend it," Larson said, stepping closer. "Which one are you?" Nathaniel held his gaze. "Wouldn't you like to know?" The tension thickened. Larson's fingers drummed against his belt. His stance shifted forward, a subtle challenge. Nathaniel didn't move, didn't break eye contact. For the first time, Larson seemed thrown off balance. Then he scoffed and took a slow step back, shaking his head. "You're real calm for a guy in this situation." Nathaniel's smile barely changed. "Should I be worried?" Larson's smirk returned, but there was something forced about it now. "Guess we'll find out." He stepped back again, slipping Nathaniel's license into his chest pocket. "Let's see what else we find." Nathaniel's fingers curled slightly at his side. "You've already searched me," he reminded him. Larson shrugged. "I don't take chances." His gaze flicked toward the car. "Open the trunk." Nathaniel exhaled through his nose. "That won't be necessary." Larson arched a brow. "That's so." He reached for his radio, pressing the mic button. "Dispatch. I've got a possible suspicious vehicle here. I need backup." Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. Larson wasn't backing down. He was pushing, and he still had no idea who he was dealing with. Nathaniel stayed quiet, watching as Larson took another slow step toward the car. "You refusing a lawful order?" Larson asked. Nathaniel met his gaze. "I'm refusing an unlawful one," Larson smirked. "That your final answer?" Nathaniel didn't respond. Larson hummed. "Guess I'll have to do it myself." He moved toward the passenger side, reaching for the door handle. Nathaniel's voice cut through the air. "Don't!" Larson froze mid-motion, fingers inches from the handle. Slowly, he turned back, brows raised. "You telling me what to do now?" Nathaniel took a step forward, his expression still calm, but carrying something sharper now. "You've searched me. You've run my license. You have nothing." Larson tilted his head. "That right?" Nathaniel nodded. "And yet, here we are." Larson's fingers twitched at his side. His smirk flickered, then returned. "You think you're in control here?" Nathaniel exhaled. "Number, I think you're out of control." A beat of silence. Larson's expression darkened. His hand drifted just slightly toward his belt again. Nathaniel didn't move. Larson let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders. Then he smirked. "You know what? I think we should continue this conversation at the station." Nathaniel's gaze didn't waver. Larson cocked his head. "Step to the curb." Nathaniel stayed where he was. Now, the air felt heavier. Then, the faint crackle of Larson's radio broke the silence. "Unit 12, status update?" Larson's fingers tightened around the device at his shoulder. He hesitated. Nathaniel saw it, the smallest flicker of doubt. Larson glanced at Nathaniel again, waiting for something, a crack in composure, a flash of uncertainty. Nathaniel gave him nothing. Larson's jaw tensed. Then, without a word, he reached into his chest pocket and pulled out Nathaniel's license. He stared at it for a second longer than necessary. Then, slowly, he handed it back. Nathaniel took it, slipping it into his wallet without looking away. Larson's smirk returned, but it wasn't as steady as before. "This ain't over." Nathaniel pocketed his wallet. "It is for you." Larson held his gaze. For the first time that night, he looked uncertain. Nathaniel took a slow step forward, his tone unreadable. "Be careful what you push for, officer." Larson swallowed. Nathaniel's expression didn't change. Then, after a beat, he turned, walking back to his car. Larson stood there, unmoving, his fingers flexing at his side. He had just lost control of the situation, and something told him he was about to lose a whole lot more. Larson stood rigid, his hand twitching slightly near his belt as he weighed his next move. The situation wasn't unfolding the way he expected. Nathaniel remained still, unbothered, watching Larson with a kind of patience that wasn't forced, but honed. Larson exhaled sharply, as if trying to regain control. "I said," he repeated, slower this time. "Step to the curb." Nathaniel didn't blink. Larson shifted his stance. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Nathaniel took a slow step forward. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't submissive either. Just enough to make Larson hesitate. "Harder for who?" Nathaniel's voice was calm, almost detached. Larson stiffened. Nathaniel reached into his inner jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately. Larson's fingers flexed over his holster. "Careful," Larson warned. Nathaniel ignored him. With the same measured calm, he pulled out a small black wallet and flipped it open. The golden badge inside gleamed under the streetlights. Nathaniel's gaze didn't waver. "Nathaniel Carter," he said, his voice steady. "Chief of Internal Affairs." Silence. Larson's expression didn't change, at first. His eyes flickered to the badge, then back to Nathaniel's face, like he was waiting for the joke to land. It didn't. His smirk twitched, then faltered entirely. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. A long beat stretched between them. Then slowly, Larson took a step back. Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. "Something wrong, officer?" Larson's throat bobbed. His lips parted again, but nothing coherent left them. "Wait a minute." The words barely made it out, uneven and strained. Nathaniel let him flounder for a second longer before cutting in. "You didn't know who I was," he said, his voice even, unhurried. "But that didn't matter, did it?" Larson's face paled further. Nathaniel took another step forward, closing the distance Larson had instinctively created. "You made a decision," Nathaniel continued, "the moment I stepped out of that car. And now—" He let the weight of the moment settle. "You get to live with it," Larson swallowed. The radio at his shoulder crackled. "Unit 12, status update." Larson didn't move. "Unit 12?" The dispatcher's voice repeated, sharper this time. Larson licked his lips, his gaze darting toward the patrol car, as if it held the answer to a way out. It didn't. Nathaniel exhaled, glancing toward the radio. "Maybe you should answer that," he suggested. Larson's fingers hovered near the device, but he didn't press the button. His breathing was uneven now, his body rigid. Nathaniel let the silence stretch, his patience unwavering. Then Larson's fingers finally twitched over his radio. "Unit 12, he muttered, voice lower than before. "All clear." Nathaniel nodded once. "Good." Larson stood frozen, eyes locked on Nathaniel's badge, as if hoping it would disappear if he stared long enough. But it wouldn't. And neither would the consequences of tonight. Nathaniel's voice remained measured as he spoke again. "Do you have any other questions, officer?" Larson's jaw tightened. A muscle twitched near his temple. Then, stiffly, he shook his head. Nathaniel exhaled, sliding his badge back into his pocket with practiced ease. He turned slightly, as if to leave, but then hesitated. "One more thing," Larson tensed. Nathaniel's gaze pinned him in place. You like being a cop, don't you? Larson said nothing. Nathaniel's tone remained conversational. I imagine it makes you feel powerful, in control. Larson's hands curled into fists at his sides. But the problem with power, Nathaniel continued, is that it only lasts as long as the people above you allow it. Larson's breath hitched. Nathaniel let the words sink in. Then, with that same unhurried grace, he turned fully and walked back toward his car. He reached for the door handle, then paused, a final glance over his shoulder. Be careful what you push for, officer. Larson didn't respond. Nathaniel slid into his seat and pulled the door shut. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Then, Nathaniel started the engine. As the Mercedes rolled forward, Larson remained standing in the street, hands clenched at his sides, his entire body taut with something between disbelief and dread. He had spent the last 10 minutes trying to make Nathaniel feel small. And now, as the taillights disappeared down the road, Larson had never felt smaller in his life. He had just made the biggest mistake of his career. And deep down, he knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Larson sat stiffly at the long wooden table, his fingers gripping the edge, just enough to keep them from shaking. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, the only sound in the room besides the occasional rustle of papers. Across from him, Chief Daniels held a thick folder. His expression was unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. Nathaniel Carter sat beside him, arms crossed, gaze steady. Larson forced himself to keep his chin up. His badge still sat on his chest, for now. Daniels flipped the folder open and began reading aloud. Officer Bradley Larson. Multiple complaints over the past 5 years. Excessive stops without cause. Use of unnecessary force. Violation of protocol. The words fell heavy in the room, each one a blow Larson hadn't been prepared for. Daniels continued. We have dashcam footage, body cam records, witness testimonies. Enough to paint a very clear picture. Larson shifted in his seat. Chief, Daniels cut him off with a sharp look. Don't. Larson's mouth snapped shut. Nathaniel exhaled, shaking his head. It's not just last night, officer. It's a pattern. One that stops today. Larson swallowed. His jaw tightened. I was doing my job. Daniels slammed the folder shut. No, you were abusing it. The words landed hard. Larson's hands curled into fists on his lap. Daniels leaned back, his tone now measured but firm. As of this moment, you are relieved of duty. Effective immediately. Larson's breath caught. His badge felt heavier on his chest. Daniels wasn't finished. And, given the severity of these violations, we are forwarding the findings to the Department of Justice for further review. There will be an investigation. Larson's pulse hammered in his ears. Trained instinct told him to argue, to push back. But one glance at Nathaniel, sitting calm, composed, waiting for a reaction, made him hesitate. He had lost. The realization sank in like a lead weight. Daniels gestured toward the table. Badge and gun, now. Larson hesitated. The room felt smaller. His hands felt like they weren't his own as he reached up and unpinned the badge from his uniform. He set it down, the metallic sound unnervingly final. His sidearm followed. Daniels nodded. Dismissed. Larson's fingers twitched. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He forced himself to his feet, but the ground felt unsteady beneath him. Nathaniel watched without expression as Larson turned and made his way to the door. Just before he reached it, Daniels spoke again. Larson, he stopped. The chief's voice was lower this time. You brought this on yourself. Larson didn't turn around. He swallowed hard, then walked out. The precinct hallways felt different. Quieter, colder. Every officer he passed knew. He could see it in the way they glanced at him, then quickly looked away. Some had heard the whispers. Others had probably seen the footage. The details didn't matter anymore, just the outcome. He was done. Two officers stood near the main desk. One of them, a younger cop Larson had worked with before, shifted awkwardly as Larson approached. Larson met his gaze. The younger officer held it for a moment, then turned away. Not a word, not a nod, nothing. Larson's chest tightened. He stepped through the main doors, into the evening air. He stood still for a moment, hands at his sides. For years, he had walked in and out of this building with authority, with confidence. Now, for the first time, he realized he had never felt smaller. Larson pulled his car door open, sliding into the driver's seat. His hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white. The reality of what had just happened settled in, pressing against his ribs. He reached for his phone. His fingers hesitated over the screen before he tapped a number. It rang. Once, twice. Then it clicked. "Hey, it's me," Larson said quickly. "Listen, I need to talk to someone about—" Click. The line went dead. He stared at the screen. The call had been declined. He tried another number, straight to voicemail. He clenched his jaw, gripping the phone tight before tossing it onto the passenger seat. He was radioactive. No one wanted to be near him now. Not his colleagues. Not his friends. Maybe not even his family. His reflection in the rearview mirror looked different. Smaller. Weaker. Lost. He exhaled shakily, hands running through his hair. The weight of it all, his choices, his arrogance, his downfall, finally hit him in full. And for the first time, Bradley Larson realized he wasn't the one in control anymore. Not now. Not ever again. Back inside the precinct, Nathaniel Carter stepped out of the meeting room, walking toward the exit with calm, steady strides. He adjusted his suit jacket, exhaling as he reached the door. Daniel's voice rang out behind him. "Carter." Nathaniel turned. The chief studied him for a moment before giving a firm nod. "Good work." Nathaniel returned the nod. Then, without another word, he stepped outside. The air was crisp. The city lights flickered in the distance. Nathaniel paused, looking out at the skyline. Justice wasn't about one case, one officer. It was about the bigger picture. And tonight, a small part of that picture had been corrected. He straightened his cuffs and walked toward his car. Tomorrow there would be more work to do, and he'd be ready for it. Nathaniel Carter stood at the front of the room. A group of cadets sat before him, eyes locked, waiting. The words ethics and accountability and law enforcement flashed on the screen behind him. He scanned their faces, some eager, some uncertain. A few carried the same quiet defiance he had seen before. He knew that look. Nathaniel's voice was firm. "Power doesn't corrupt people. It reveals them." No one spoke. "You'll soon wear a badge. It gives you authority, but not integrity. It lets you change lives, but not always for the better." A few cadets shifted. "A uniform doesn't make you righteous. A title doesn't make you just. A badge doesn't make you good. But how you use it, that will define you." He let that settle before finishing. There are two kinds of officers. Those who wear the badge with honor, and those who hide behind it. Silence. Decide now which one you'll be. Nathaniel turned and walked out. No one moved. They had heard enough. If this story resonated with you, let us know in the comments. What would you have done in this situation? Share your thoughts below. If you believe stories like this need to be told, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Justice starts with awareness. Let's keep the conversation going.